So here, model first. Before we start, I just would like to point out that most of the issues that we're going to discuss today refer to public blockchain, which are open, propertyless, and are designed, let's say, to be uncontrolled, someone told. But on the contrary, of course, when we discuss about blockchain that are defined as private, although they're structured on the basis of a decentralized logic, limit access to a small number of actors, it is definitely more easy to provide through a regulation the rules of this actor. So many of the data privacy requirements that we're going to analyze today are simple to interpret in private permission blockchain networks, then of course in public permissionless networks. And so right now, public networks are here to stay and represent definitely a vital space of innovation, and they need more discussion. So model one, let's start with some key questions on this first model on data protection laws and regulation. So first of all, I would like to address together this question. What is data privacy and why it is important? What are the trends in data protection legislation? And what are the core principles and the requirements of European Union General Data Protection Regulation? And this in order to learn the following lessons. First of all, define data privacy. Secondly, explore which are the trends, the current data protection legislation. And thirdly, in order to analyze the European Union General Data Protection Regulation principle and requirements, and I will explain you in a bit why we're going to discuss particularly this kind of regulation, so in a European law. And here, the first, our first question that is really a starting point. So what is data privacy and why it is important? Well, data privacy generally means the ability of a person to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent personal information about them is shared with or is communicating to others. And this personal information can be one's name, can be the location, the contact information, or even online or real world behavior. Data privacy governs how data is collected, is shared, and used. So data privacy means empowering users to make their own decisions about who can process their data and for what purpose. But in many jurisdictions, privacy is considered a fundamental human right, and data protection law really exists to guard, to protect this right. Anyway, personal data can also be misused in a number of ways if it's not kept private, or if people do not have the ability to control how their data is used. And so let's see now that we have defined what is data privacy, even very briefly, why is data privacy important? Well, to answer this question, we need to consider two business imperatives: business asset management and regulatory compliance. First of all, data is perhaps the most relevant assets for a company. And that's because we live in a digital world where companies find really great values in collecting, in sharing, and in using data about customers, about client users. And transparency in how businesses request consent to keep personal data, followed also by privacy policy, and manage the data they have collected is really essential to build trust with customers who, of course, expect privacy as a human right because it's being recognized as a human right. And then regulatory compliance, this is another business imperative because the data management need to ensure regulatory compliance. And so the regulatory compliance is even more important. A company needs to meet legal requirements about how data are collected, how data are stored, used, and processed, and non-compliance could lead to huge fine. Also, if a business becomes the victim of a hack, there could be several consequences, especially in terms of lost revenue and lost customer trust. So protecting personal data is really becoming a fundamental policy goal worldwide, especially if we think that, for instance, has been included among the fundamental rights in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And that's been observed recently by the European Union Blockchain and Observatory Focum report that data has really become the lifeblood of our society, as well as an increasingly valuable asset. And we can see that especially because now there are so many, especially at the European level, so many strategies that address data. We do have a digital strategy, we do have a data strategy, and also recently in March 2021 was adopted a blockchain strategy. So basically data are now at the center of the world. And so blockchain that use data as well, it's recognized as a fundamental technology. So let's see now what are the trends in data privacy legislation now that we know what is data privacy and why it is important. So first of all, I would like to highlight that there is not global data protection law. There are principles such as Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also OECD privacy principle that were developed in the 80s. They represent a common source for many data protection laws and regulations. But there is significant variation around the world, so there are many difficulties to consider. Blockchain systems, as you may know, are often borderless, and so given the inherent uncertainty about where data, assets, and even counterparties are located in a blockchain environment, then a key question is how to determine if and which data protection laws applies to these relationship and assets. And what does it mean, however, is that compliance with data protection law in the context of blockchain is really a complex topic and require consideration of each of the law where legal entities, but also headquarters, nodes, and ultimately users are located. But despite these complexities, there are also some key issues and concerns that are likely to arise in most, if not even all jurisdiction, when it comes to compliance with privacy requirement in the context of blockchain application. And so in this context, it is not possible, of course, to present a comprehensive overview of all data protection laws and regulations that may apply to an international blockchain solution. But what is important to understand is that there are current regimes, current legislation that perpetuate a traditional data protection framework that definitely challenges technology as blockchain. And this because this framework assumes that data in our digital world is controlled by identifiable actors. But however, blockchain technology has a completely different approach. If we consider that it's able to achieve radical decentralization of data. But again, if we look at recent data privacy frameworks, something that we're going to do now, we realize that legislators do not appear to have focus on blockchain technology and its unique feature when drafting or revising these laws and regulation. And so together we'll see today really what goes to clash with data protection framework. And here you can see some of the main important frameworks all over the world. So we do have different legal regimes, in particular in the European Union and in the US. There were recent changes in the data protection legislation that really have the potential to affect blockchain technology user, even if these jurisdictions have approached data privacy in a very different way. But again, in this slide, you can see the most important regulatory privacy, some of the most important regulatory privacy framework to know that include the General Data Protection Regulation, the European General Data Protection Regulation, because the European Union takes a comprehensive approach with this regulation that was entering into force in 2018. And this regulation regulates how the personal data of European Union data subject, we will see who are the data subjects, so the individuals that can be collected, stored, and processed, and gives data subject rights to control their personal data. Then in the United States, the situation is different because there is not a comprehensive federal data protection framework, but there is a range of state and federal laws that cover specific data sets in particular industry sectors. For instance, we have the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act for financial institutions, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, that some of you, if they're from the States, they may know, of course. But in the absence of a federal data privacy law, each state has its own its own data privacy law. And this tend really to focus on data breach rather than to create robust data privacy regime. To this end, there is in particular one legislation that I would like to point out, American legislation, that is the California Consumer Private Act of 2018, because this represents a state-level data protection law in the US, and because other similar legislation is right now under consideration in several other states. This California Consumer Privacy Act requires that consumers be made aware of what personal data is collected and give consumer control over their personal data, including a right to tell the organization not to sell their personal data. And then we do have several national data protection laws. Many countries, such as, for instance, Canada, but also Australia, Japan, Singapore, and these are only some of the many national data protection law that exist. They do have comprehensive data protection laws in some form. Then we do also have, for instance, the Brazil General Law for the protection of personal data and UK Data Protection Act that are quite similar to the GDPR. But moving to the next slide, we are going to focus mainly today on the European GDPR, so on the General Data Protection Regulation. That's why, well, first of all, we cannot address all the different existing privacy laws today, but we will focus on these regulation, even if many aspects of this regulation, of course, there are in different regulations as well, in other regulations as well, and this is because of its broad scope and because of the potential for significant penalties for non-compliance. We will use the GDPR as a proxy for regulatory compliance obligation because GDPR's privacy requirements are probably the most strict in the world. And so this lens of analysis will allow us to understand data protection principle at play. However, once again, compliance with data protection laws and regulation is jurisdiction and use case specific. So I really invite you to obtain legal advice on jurisdictional requirements that need to take into consideration depending on the specific use case that you want to develop. Let's see more in detail these regulations. So very briefly, I would like to introduce you to the GDPR and provide you with an overview of its application to blockchain technology. And this again, because the most difficulties related to data aspect of blockchain concern the potential application of this regulation. A regulation that establishes a detailed and harmonized legislative framework across the European Union. Two are the objectives, essentially. On one hand, this data protection regulation wants to facilitate the free movement of personal data between the European Union's various member states. And on the other hand, it establishes a framework of fundamental rights protection that is based on the right to data protection. And so this legal framework creates a number of obligations resting on data controllers and also allocates an important number of rights to data subjects that can be enforced via these data controllers. And this is very relevant when we're going to discuss it with talking about blockchain technology. So we need to start from one of the most important actors of this regulation and of data privacy, that is the data subject. Who is the data subject, and which is the definition of personal data within this legislation. So it is very important to define the personal data because this is what determines the GDPR scope of application, but what determines in general all the data protection legislation. And so accordingly is particularly relevant. So this regulation applies only to data that is considered personally in nature. What can be defined as personal data has been recognized really as one of the most the central cause of doubt in the current data protection legislation. That's because the GDPR and specifically the Article 4 states that personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. That means, for example, information related to a company which does not contain personal data does not fall under the GDPR scope. But when it comes to natural person, things become more complicated since definition include a potential identifiable nature person. And so this means that the GDPR applies not just to data that seems obviously related to individuals, for instance, the name, the phone number, but also data that when combined with other data can potentially at some point and by some means be used to identify us. And in fact, according to this Article 4, the GDPR underlines that personal data is data that directly, indirect, or indirectly relates to the identifier or identifiable and an identifiable nature person. So drawing the line between personal and non-personal data can be really complicated due to the broad scope of personal data and the technical possibility to take information about data subject from data points that apparently are unrelated to them. And we will see that this will be really not easy in the blockchain world. So to understand if there are personal data involved, and so how to deal with personal data in a blockchain environment. And now we're still in the personal data definition because actually this regulation introduced also the concept of pseudonymization that is particularly relevant because a pseudonymized data is still a personal data. But what we mean for pseudonymization, it is defined as the processing of personal data in such a way that data can only be attributed to a data subject with the help of additional information. But it's really difficult, again, to establish when the line between personal and personal data is crossed in practice. The principle that should be used to determine whether data is personal data or not is that of the reasonable likelihood of identification. And then also when determining the nature of personal data, it is really important to evaluate the purpose pursued by the data controller in the data process. And then we will see that this is another key actor of the data protection, the data controller. So what happened basically is that the broad definition of personal data really can has been seen as a data protection law now is becoming the law of everything. And so in the near future, all data may be personal data, and so all data may be subject to GDPR requirements. When we talk about anonymization, on the contrary, we talk about the process of removing personal identifiers, both direct and indirect. They may lead to an individual being identified. And this is particularly relevant because if it's possible to anonymize through blockchain a data, then in that case, we're not in the personal data spectrum. And so all the provision related to personal data do not apply. And that's very, very important and help to be compliant. So another important aspect that we need to see, and all these aspects, elements, requirements are really, really important to understand which are then the key tension between blockchain and data privacy. That's why we're focusing our attention now on this. So the data controller and data processor. So we have discovered that the first actor of this regulation, so of data privacy, is the data subject, the person to whom the data relates. But now we have also to see other two important actors that are represented by the data controller and the data processor, because the GDPR identify other two relevant parties to any processing of personal data. A controller, you can find here the definition, exactly the definition that you can find in the regulation. So a controller is defined as a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which alone or jointly with others determines the purpose and the means of the processing of personal data. While a processor is defined as a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body that processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So what does it mean that in practice that the controller is the one who determines the legal basis on which the personal data is processed? And the processor is permitted to process the data only for the purposes that are prescribed by the controller. And these two actors have key roles because they have direct obligation and because they can be held directly liable for breaches of this obligation. And these actors are particularly relevant in a blockchain environment because as far as the GDPR is concerned, it has to be possible to identify a data controller, something that is not always easy in the blockchain world. So we will see later that this represents really a key tension to consider. Because again, the data controller has a key role. It is the data controller to whom data subject turns to exercise their rights that we're going to see now, and who is the one that is accountable for compliance and liable if the rules are breached. While the data processor is a body that process personal data but on behalf of the controller, depending on how the data controller designed the system. And also it is even possible to have many data processor or even not having at all. But as I say, that will be a very important point to discuss later on in the module 2. And now, which are the core data privacy principles and requirements that are so important because they will represent key issues to understand, because they can be in conflict with blockchain technology. And so we will need to really carefully look at them in order to design a compliant blockchain solution. So first of all, I would like to start from these two new legal principles that are the privacy by design and the privacy by default. Now, why I want to draw the attention on that? Because we will need to find privacy by design solution for our blockchain application. But before going to the end of the story, let's move back. So these are two new principles. The regulation provides for the need to configure data processing by introducing from the beginning, that's why it's by design, because already in the design phase, it is important to put in place the essential guarantees in order to meet the requirement of the legislation and protect, in this way, the rights of those concerned. All these must take place upstream, so before proceeding to the actual data processing, and therefore it is essential, it is an essential prerequisite for the proper processing of data. And then we have the principle of privacy by default that require the adoption of appropriate technical and organization measures that are by default those that guarantee in each specific case the protection of processed data. And controllers that we've seen before what are really need to consider how to comply with the GDPR, both when designing their processes and implementing their system. So it will really key to introduce and to respect this principle even in blockchain solution. And now let's see the privacy principle. These are really, really relevant because the GDPR, as other data protection laws, actually they all provide for system of governance of personal data that are based on the accountability of the organization, and more precisely in this case on the accountability of the data controller for all the risks that are associated with the processing of data. And in particular, the GDPR lists in Article 5 the 6 principles that you can see in the slide that are really essential to data protection, and that are the data processing must be lawful, must be fair and transparent. Number 2, the purpose limitation. The data processes must be limited to the specific purpose for which it was originally collected. This is a particular relevant principle we will see in connection with blockchain, because personal data shall be collected only for specified, explicit, and legitimate purpose, and only used for this purpose that have been stated. This makes it unlawful, for instance, for a controller to repurpose data it has collected for one purpose for another, and so even archiving purpose in the public interest, for instance. And then we have the principle of data minimization, that is another critical one, that say the only data absolutely necessary for the specific purpose may be collected. So the personal data collected should be always adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary for the stated purpose. This makes it unlawful to ask for data that is not necessary, but also means that we need to minimize the data something that actually doesn't happen on a blockchain platform. So we will discuss this later. And then again, we have another principle, that the accuracy principle, because data must be accurate and up to date. That means that when necessary needs to keep up to date, data subject have the right, for instance, among other things, to ask that if the data are inaccurate. And then retention limitation, data must not be kept longer than necessary. So data held by a controller has to be amended. Controller must take every reasonable step to either fix or erase such data. And of course, this can be very complicated in a blockchain environment. And then data must be processed securely, and this is the principle of integrity and confidentiality. And another thing that I want to underline here is that in addition of all these principles, then the GDPR say that processing can be lawful only if a data subject consent to it. So even the concept of consent is very important in a blockchain environment where not always it's possible to obtain consent. And this the consent needs to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. And now, as the last part of this module, the other important requirements, like elements of this regulation, is the one that relates to data subject rights, because it is now clear that what is a data subject? We say that it's an individual whose personal data is at issue. And the GDPR in particular, but also the other protection law, always recognize a number of rights to individuals, so to data subject, including the right to information, the right to access, the right to rectification, to erasure, to restriction of processing, data portability, and the right to object to profiling. These rights must be all respected and enforced by the relevant controller. So again, the important actor, the data controller, important actor of the regulation. Any relevant processor should also be subject to contractual obligation to the controller to assist the controller in upholding such rights. And so processor really will have many direct obligation under the GDPR, but in any case, both controllers and processor are subject to enforcement by data protection regulator. And I would like to highlight all of that, this right, and the fact that it can be exercised at any time by a data subject. And this is, again, because that could be really in conflict with blockchain. With blockchain application. For instance, a data subject can expect to have clear and easy to understand information on how their personal data is collected and processed, or demand, for instance, that the erroneous personal data can be corrected. Something that I may imagine for you could sound weird, considering that it's so in conflict with what is blockchain. The right of amendment, or the right to erase or to be forgotten, we will see later on today. But it is possible to demand access to the personal data in a commonly used. That's one of the other rights. It is possible to object to the processing of their personal data for profiling. And in our context, we will see that the most important set of rights for data subject that we will need to carefully analyze are the right of rectification, the right to erasure, again, because the data subject have also the right to have personal data no longer needed for the purpose of lawful processing be deleted, and the right of access. That means that the data subject have a right to inquire of a data controller if their personal data is being processed, and if so, to receive certain details about this is how it's been done and where. And so, to summarize this first module, let's say that at the end of this module, I believe could be more clear than even if countries and jurisdictions have approached data privacy differently, and we have especially focused our attention on the GDPR, all the current legislation provide a traditional data protection framework that is challenging for blockchain user. And that's because they require especially data controllers or business to determine the purpose for and means of processing, because there are data processor or service provider that work on the on data controllers' behalf. And so basically the actual data protection legislation hold the frameworks they exist, they require a centralized entity that control both the data that are collected and their service provider relationship. And this is clearly in conflict with the structure of blockchain technology, distributed peer-to-peer network. So this is as a first and let's say introductory model. I see there are probably some questions already. Yes, I would like to address all the questions at the very end. At the very end, if that's okay for you. Okay, so if you want, I can address very quickly these 3 questions. Now, about do we want me to address that all at the end, or do we want me to address that now a bit? What do you think? We can keep it all for the end if you want.
All at the end, all at the end. Excellent, excellent session. Thank you, Claudia. Go ahead.
Very briefly, just because there was someone say, Carla, that we're not discussing China's privacy protection laws. You're right. There are many different regulations. I tried to put someone from Asia, someone from, let's say, Latin America, someone from Europe, but of course there are also privacy protection laws in China as well. It was impossible to put all of them in a slide, but there are many different data protection laws. So only to say that really I didn't choose one country instead of another. I just wanted to address the GDPR because, of course, it's one of the most strict regulations. So if you comply basically with the GDPR, then you're safe.